This is an introduction for the paper, The Unity of Moral Attitudes, Recipe Semantics, and Creedal Acceptation. The paper is about a problem for non-cognitivists in metaethics. Non-cognitivists think that moral judgments are not ordinary beliefs, despite their surface form. They do not have a special representational content that makes them moral beliefs, the way that beliefs about legality do. Instead, moral judgments get to be moral judgments because of their non-cognitive properties. For instance, a non-cognitivist might say that moral judgments have a certain motivational capacity. When we judge that something is wrong, we're disinclined to do it. We're more inclined to chastise or blame other people for doing it. The fact that the attitude inclines us to act in these ways is what makes it a moral judgment. The problem that I focus on concerns the unity of moral attitudes. Non-cognitivists typically focus on straightforwardly predicative moral judgments. These are judgments that have the form action of type X falls under moral category Y. However, we're capable of having many kinds of moral attitudes that don't fit into this form. For instance, consider the attitude, it's not wrong to collect trophies of extinct species. Or the attitude, if it had been wrong to bring children into this world, we would not have done it. These attitudes don't have the characteristic bearing on action that straightforwardly predicative moral judgments do. Or consider the action, you should keep track of what you shouldn't do. This mixes two different kinds of normativity. It's not clear how non-cognitivists can make sense of embedding one normative content inside of another. Or consider the attitude of being uncertain about what the right thing to do is. This too appears to be a moral attitude, but it doesn't have the motivational profile that straightforwardly predicative moral judgments do. These attitudes all have something in common. The problem of the unity of moral attitudes is to say what this is. Why are they all moral attitudes? If moral judgments, at least straightforwardly predicative moral judgments, are characterized by a motivational capacity, what makes these other judgments, these other attitudes, moral attitudes? Why should they be classified along with moral judgments? If they lack moral judgments, specific non-cognitive properties, and they don't share any representational content. The paper attempts to provide a solution to this problem. The solution that I offer makes use of some cognitive machinery. So I spend a large part of the paper presenting this machinery and trying to show that it's coherent. In particular, I need what I call the presentational theory of mind. The presentational theory of mind is a spin on the representational theory of mind. According to the representational theory of mind, the mind employs representations in the service of attitudes. Our beliefs, for example, involve cognitive representations that represent the contents believed. According to the view, these representations are not mere theoretical artifacts. They have an appearance in the brain. They are structures of concepts, and the concepts that they are built out of can be re-identified in different contexts without knowing their semantic properties. It is the existence of these kinds of patterns, I suggest, that is what makes semantics possible in the first place. A concept must have a life, a behavioral pattern before it can acquire a meaning. The presentational theory of mind is an extension of the representational theory of mind. It says that our minds employ representations in the same sense as the representational theory of mind. But it also says that our minds employ things that look very much like representations in terms of the cognitive machinery involved, but which do not have representational contents. These other things, these presentations, might still have coherent functional roles. They might still perform other duties in the mind, but they do not represent. So the judgment that murder is wrong might be a presentation that includes a token concept wrongness. This concept does not contribute representational content to the presentation. The presentation does not have a characteristic representational content that makes it the presentation that it is. Instead, the concept conveys to the presentation and to the attitude that we take to that presentation a certain kind of motivational force. By including the moral concept in the presentation, the resulting attitude has the motivational profile that is characteristic of straightforwardly predicative moral judgments. But this may only be in certain special contexts. In other contexts, the moral concept might help to make the attitudes that it gets included in, the attitudes that they are, simply by its identity as a moral concept. So here's my proposal. I propose that moral attitudes are attitudes that involve moral presentations. A moral presentation is a presentation that incorporates a moral concept. A moral concept is a concept that plays a certain distinctive role in a very special context. Moral concepts can occur in other contexts where they do not play this special role. The special context for moral concepts is straightforwardly predicative moral judgments. It is by conveying the characteristic functional role in the context of straightforwardly predicative moral judgments that moral concepts get to be moral concepts. That is what gives them their moral identity. Other moral attitudes are moral attitudes in virtue of employing these moral concepts in their presentations. In their presentations, moral concepts don't have to play their characteristic functional role. Their presence alone will guarantee that the attitude that results is a moral attitude. The proposal has some of the flavor of an error theory. I claim that moral concepts might be able to appear in many situations in which they have no specific function, in which they help to compose an attitude that can't be characterized other than by the parts that it's composed out of. You might wonder why this should be possible. Why is it that we are able to have attitudes that don't have any particular distinctive functional role, that are only able to be characterized in terms of their parts? I think there's a plausible explanation that can be given for this in terms of the evolution of moral cognition. And in the paper, I sketch a possible story that I think will help to soften the implausibility of these kinds of superfluous contexts. There are many cases in evolution where traits arise because they are connected with more directly useful traits. These traits are called spandrels. And spandrels are often physiological, but they can also be cognitive. I propose that many kinds of moral attitudes are cognitive spandrels. They evolved alongside moral judgments. They're byproducts of the same forces that gave us moral judgments. But while moral judgments have a point, they do not. I think there's a very plausible story that we can tell about where moral attitudes came from that makes the existence of these spandrel contexts not surprising. The story goes like this. There's an important difference between moral sentiments and moral attitudes. Moral sentiments are feelings and emotions that get us to act in moral ways. For example, guilt or empathy are moral sentiments. Moral attitudes, on the other hand, have the appearance of propositional attitudes. They look just like the kinds of attitudes we have that have representational contents. These two different kinds of moral mental states might have very different evolutionary explanations. It's possible, I think fairly probable, that our moral sentiments have been evolving over the past several million years. But our moral attitudes have developed largely within the last 100,000 years. Moral attitudes had to come from somewhere. And so some previously existing capacity had to be fit to a new purpose. I propose that the capacity that was remolded to allow for moral judgments was the same capacity that allows for representational beliefs. In other words, moral judgments are a non-cognitive branch off of representational beliefs. If our moral attitudes really did develop in the last 100,000 years, it would be an extremely short period of evolutionary time. And so if moral attitudes did evolve over this lifespan, then it would not be surprising if they still had some rough edges. If they pulled along a number of other attitudes that didn't have the same clarity of purpose that they do. Moral attitudes, I claim, are the result of the rapid acceptation of beliefs into moral judgments. There was a strong selective pressure for moral judgments. This pressure utilized the cognitive structures of belief, and in being changed from beliefs into non-cognitive states, moral judgments also pulled along with them other proposition-like attitudes. Moral judgments are not beliefs, even though they look like them. Moral concepts are not representational, but moral concepts can still appear in a number of different contexts. The different contexts they appear in are moral attitudes, and this is what I claim explains the unity of moral attitudes.